Morning, everyone. Scripture reading for today is from Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 62. Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 62. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him to the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them, and a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. When Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly.
Morning, everyone. It's good to be here. Good to see all of you present this morning. Thank you for reading for us this morning, Vamsy. We've been looking at some of the events from the life of Peter over the past couple of sermons. And last week we saw how after Peter had confessed Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus then began to teach his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem to suffer many things at the hands of the religious leaders. He told them that he would be killed, but on the third day he would be raised from the dead. And Peter thought that Jesus should not be talking like that about such things, telling him, well, this will never happen to you. But Peter's objection only showed that he really did not understand Jesus' purpose and the necessity for him to go to Jerusalem to suffer and die. Well, eventually Jesus and his disciples arrived there in Jerusalem, Jesus making his triumphant entry into the city at the beginning of the Passover week. And over the following days of that week, the things that Jesus had spoken of to his disciples would be fulfilled. This morning, we want to focus upon Peter's role during those last days of Jesus' life, and that one incident in particular for which Peter is well known, his denial of Jesus, something that is recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. The story is presented to us in 4 scenes. The first scene in our story takes place in the upper room of a house in Jerusalem. It's in the evening time, and Jesus and his disciples have gathered in this room in order to celebrate the Passover, that remembrance of that deliverance of the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt, time when the Passover lamb would be slain and the meal would be eaten. And this evening, the conversation around the table concerned the things that would soon happen to Jesus. He spoke about his betrayal and his arrest, his crucifixion and his resurrection, and the disciples deserting him. John, in his account of this in John chapter 13, verses 31 to 33, tells us that when Judas left the upper room and went out into the night to put into action his plan to betray Jesus, Jesus said to the remaining disciples, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and in him God is glorified. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while, and I am with you. You will seek me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." Jesus' words are puzzling, and Peter's reaction to them is recorded in verses 36 to 38. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why cannot I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the cock will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. In Mark's account of these events, Jesus first warned his disciples that they would all fall away. You will all fall away, he said, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But then it was Peter who said, even though they all fall away, I will not. Well, Peter may have had his doubts about the other disciples, but no self-doubt about himself. And it was then that Jesus warned him, truly I say to you, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter still insisted that he would not deny Jesus. Mark tells us in chapter 14, verse 31, but he said vehemently, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. Well, Peter may not have fully understood what Jesus was saying when he spoke about going away, but wherever Jesus was going, Peter wanted to go with him. And Peter expressed his willingness to lay down his life for Jesus. And Peter was very sure of himself that even if it meant his own death, he was not going to deny Jesus. Second scene in our story takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane. After the Passover meal had been eaten, Jesus and his disciples left the upper room. They made their way outside of the city, crossing the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane on the slopes of Mount of Olives. This was a place that Jesus had often brought his disciples. And he had come there that evening to spend time in prayer to his Father in heaven, knowing that he would soon be arrested, praying that if it were possible that this cup might pass from him, but accepting that it was the Lord's will that must be done. And he had chosen Peter and James and John to be closest to him as he prayed there in the garden. Later that night, Judas arrived in the garden, leading those who had come to arrest Jesus. When Jesus had been identified by Judas's kiss and arrested, it was Peter who stepped forward to defend his Lord. John chapter 18, verses 10 and 11 records his actions. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which the Father has given me? Peter, who earlier on in the evening had said he would not deny Jesus and would be willing to die for Jesus, seemed to be making good on his word, that he is prepared to put up a fight in order to prevent the arrest of Jesus. This was his way of showing his loyalty and his devotion to Jesus. Well, if you want to take him, you're going to have to get me first. But there was to be no resistance. Peter had misunderstood Jesus' purpose, that this was how it was meant to be. And so Jesus tells Peter, put your sword away. There is a cup that needs to be drunk, and Peter's actions would be preventing that from happening. And after Jesus was arrested there in the garden, the disciples fled from the scene, fulfilling the prophecy that Jesus had quoted earlier, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. The third scene takes place in the courtyard of the high priest. Although the disciples fled from the garden when Jesus was arrested, Peter had followed from a distance. Luke, in our reading, chapter 22, verse 54, says, then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. Peter followed at a distance. Peter wanted to know, how is this all going to end? What's going to become of Jesus? He wanted to follow in order to find out. Perhaps he thought he could do something about it. And Peter was not alone in following Jesus. There was another unnamed disciple who may have been the disciple John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He had also followed Jesus. John chapter 18, verses 15 and 16 provides us with the details of how these two disciples were able to enter into the courtyard of the high priest. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. As this disciple was known to the high priest, he entered the court of the high priest along with Jesus, while Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the maid who kept the door and brought Peter in. So through the influence of this unnamed disciple, Peter was able to gain entry to the courtyard of the high priest. And we have to admire Peter for his courage here. He's placing himself in danger, at great risk. He's entered in amongst the enemies of Jesus because he wanted to see how things are going to turn out. And it was Peter's love and attachment to Jesus which caused him to endanger himself in this way. And whereas the other disciples had all fled, Peter had kept his word that he would not desert Jesus, that he wanted to remain close to Jesus. He wanted to show him that loyalty, that allegiance. And in the courtyard, Peter then found himself in an uncomfortable situation amongst Jesus' enemies. And the words that he had so confidently spoken there in the upper room, in the presence of Jesus and the other disciples, the loyalty he had proclaimed and was ready to display in the garden when he drew his sword, well, that's now going to be put to a severe test in a hostile situation. It's easy to make promises of what we will do when we're not put under any pressure, when we're amongst friends. But now Peter is on his own and he's about to face the pressure. The first test of Peter's allegiance came from the maid there in the courtyard. Luke says, and when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a maid, seeing him as he sat in the light and gazing at him, said, this man also was with him. Peter had just been trying to keep himself warm by the fire, remain inconspicuous, when the maid had spotted him, and she was gazing at him. Perhaps she was not sure, but the longer she gazed, the more certain she became, and she pointed him out to the others. This man also was with him. John records her words, are you not also one of his disciples? Peter's been put on the spot now. What does he do now? Well, if he admits, yes, I was with him, is he going to be arrested too? And Peter's impulsive response is to deny the accusation. Luke says, but he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. I'm not one of his disciples. Well, Matthew and Mark tell us that Peter now withdrew from the fireside and he went out to the porch or the gateway. Peter didn't want to draw any further attention to himself there by the fire. But here again, he's recognized by another maid who said to those standing nearby, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And for the second time, Peter denied it. Matthew says that he now reinforced his denial with an oath, calling upon God to witness that he was telling the truth. As God is my witness, I do not know this man. Luke tells us that there's now an interval of about 1 hour before Peter is challenged for a third time. Another insisted, saying, certainly this man was also with him, for he is a Galilean. We can hear his accent. John says, one of the servants of the high priest, the kinsman of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? So by this time, several people have recognized Peter. He was the one who was with Jesus. He's a disciple. He's a follower of Jesus. And the accusations are coming thick and fast. He speaks with a Galilean accent. I saw him in the garden. Isn't he the one who cut off my cousin's ear? There can't be any doubt about it. This man was with Jesus. But Peter still sticks to his story. He started off down this road and he has to stick to it. And he denies ever being with Jesus or ever knowing Jesus. Matthew says, then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. Again, he's reinforcing his denial, this time by calling down a curse upon himself. May God curse me if I'm not telling the truth, hoping that this is going to convince these people that he's telling the truth and he has no knowledge of Jesus. Well, at that moment, whilst Peter was still speaking, and above all of the clamour of this heated discussion that's going on, came the clear and the distinct sound of a cock crowing, like the alarm clock suddenly going off in the morning. And from somewhere in that courtyard, Jesus turned and he looked at Peter. And immediately Peter knew what he had done, and he knew that Jesus knew. Luke records this dramatic moment. He says, and immediately, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. The sound of the cock crowing, the look of Jesus cut Peter to the heart. And he realized this dreadful sin that he had just committed. And he quickly left the courtyard, weeping those bitter tears of sorrow. Peter, the man who had the courage to follow Jesus into the midst of his enemies, the one who had so self-confidently professed his loyalty to Jesus, the one who had expressed his willingness to go and die with Jesus, left that courtyard in tears, distraught, knowing the full extent of what he had done. And just as Jesus had said he would, he had denied the one that he loved the most. Peter was heartbroken, inconsolable. Now, when it had mattered most, he'd failed. I don't know him. I'm not with him. I'm not one of his disciples. The story's not yet over. Yes, Jesus is going to be taken away and Jesus will be crucified. 3 days later, he will rise again from the dead. But there's another ending to this story. And the final scene takes place sometime later, after the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And it takes place at some distance from that courtyard, described for us by John in the final chapter of his book, chapter 21. Early morning on the Sea of Galilee, Peter and some of the other disciples have been out fishing all night and they've caught nothing. And then suddenly there's someone who's standing on the shore calling out to them, asking them, have you caught any fish? And they say, no fish. And that stranger tells them, well, cast your nets onto the other side of the boat. And they do so. And when they do that, they pull in this huge haul of fish. And you wonder, did this remind them of something that had happened a few years earlier, of another time on the Sea of Galilee when they'd been out fishing and hadn't caught anything, and a man called Jesus told them to go out again, and they pulled in a great haul of fish? Did that come back to their minds? Perhaps it did. And John is the first one then to recognize this stranger on the shore, and he says to Peter, it is the Lord. And with that, Peter, as only Peter would do, grabbed his clothes and jumped into the sea. wanting to be the first to wade ashore and to greet Jesus. Jesus had a charcoal fire going and breakfast was ready for them. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these other disciples love me? Do you love me more than these fishing nets and this fishing boat? Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Peter replies, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." And then for a second time, Jesus asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And as for a second time, Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." And then for a third time, Jesus asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And now Peter's upset. Peter is grieved and he's wondering, why does Jesus keep asking me if I love him? And he replies, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And again, Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." 3 times in the courtyard of the high priest, around a charcoal fire, Peter had said, "I do not know this man." And now there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, around another charcoal fire, 3 times Jesus has asked him, "Do you love me?" And 3 times Peter has said, "Lord, you know that I love you." And it must have been a painful reminder to Peter of what has happened in that courtyard. It's almost as if those 3 denials have to be undone, cancelled out by these 3 affirmations of love. And then after showing Peter what type of death he would die, Jesus said to him, "Follow me, follow me." In the courtyard, Peter failed. He'd sinned in denying Jesus, and no one was more aware of that than Peter himself. But Peter repented and Christ restored him, and reconciliation took place there at the Sea of Galilee as Jesus was telling Peter that there is still a place for him. There's still a work for him to do in Christ's kingdom, that he would still be feeding and caring for Christ's sheep. And Peter goes on to fulfill that ministry as he will courageously preach the gospel as we read in the book of Acts. And there are no more denials. Now there's only the testimony of what Christ has done through his death and resurrection. But how many of us have stood where Peter stood? How many of us have heard the cock crowing, the alarm bells going off, and we've come to the realization that we've sinned and we've let Jesus down? But like Peter, we can profess our loyalty and our allegiance in the comfortable circumstances that we are in, and we want so much to do what pleases Christ. But then these moments come in our lives when, without planning it, we never planned it this way, and without really thinking it through, we make that wrong decision. We make that wrong choice. We sin, and we do the very thing that we said we would not do, the very thing that we said we could never do. And then we hear the cock crowing in our own head. We hear the alarm going off, bringing us to our senses and to the realization of what it is that we've just done. And Peter's experience is both a warning and an encouragement to us. It warns us not to rely upon our own strength. Peter fell when his faith in Jesus failed him. And instead of drawing strength from Jesus, he looked to his own ability to remain faithful. As happened when he walked upon the water, when he took his eyes off Jesus and he began to fall. Not as strong as he thought he was. And we too need to be aware of that danger of placing too much confidence in our own abilities. Well, you'll never catch me doing that. You'll never find me in a place like that. Instead of keeping our eyes fixed upon Jesus as the one who is that source of strength for us. But Peter's experience, as well as being a warning, is also an encouragement to us, because it assures us that after we have failed him, when we have sinned, we can turn back to God in repentance, and he will forgive us. He will restore us. Peter's life as a disciple of Jesus did not end abruptly at the sound of a cock crowing in some courtyard. Peter knew what he had done. Peter repented. Christ forgave him. And Peter was then entrusted with this great task of preaching the gospel of Jesus to the world, a task which he fulfilled and for which in the end he gave his life. He said he would give his life for Jesus, and he did in the end. Christ's forgiveness of Peter does not detract from the seriousness of sin, but it emphasizes the grace and the mercy of God and his willingness to forgive our sins. Peter teaches us that anyone could fall, even the strongest, even the most self-assured. But when we do fall, remember, it's not the end. God is gracious and God is merciful and willing to give us however many chances it takes, and we can come back to him. Peter did, and we can too. That whatever we have done, however we may have let Jesus down in the past, he still says to us, follow him, follow him.